Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. For this story to make sense, you must know what I do for a living. I study entomology, insects. The pay isn't phenomenal, but it is a field that I've been passionate about all my life. I specialize in the study of moths. I won't force you to read or pronounce my formal title. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. What matters is that I study moths, their diets, their reproductive habits, and their role in pollination. My research has taken me to half a dozen countries, and I have studied over 50,000 species of moth. By all accounts, I am an expert. For the account in question, I only needed to travel to Nevada. It was a 10-hour drive from my California home, but I made the most of the wind and the radio. I was expecting the trip to be routine. I was wrong. At the time, I was documenting the relationship between the Tegaticula synthetica and the Joshua trees of the southwestern United States. In Nevada's Tikaboo Valley, two varieties of Joshua trees have come to coexist. To my knowledge, the valley is the only place in the United States where this has occurred. I remain convinced that the synthetica moths have played a role in the unification of these two tree species. My plan was to travel to the valley, to establish a campsite, and to monitor the presence and behaviors of these moths over the course of 3 days. I settled on the southern side of Tikaboo Peak and elected to face my campsite west, toward the sunset. My first night passed without incident. The following afternoon, however, my studies were interrupted. The approaching rumble of an engine announced the intruder's arrival. It was so loud that it instantly grabbed my attention. It was a military-grade truck. On the road, it would have looked out of place, as if it had just slipped out of the Korean War and landed on the highway. On the mountainside, though, the vehicle looked right at home. Two military personnel, I wouldn't call them soldiers, jumped out of the truck and introduced themselves. As they spoke, loud and aggressive, they paced my campsite. They were more interested in my equipment than in what I had to say. I had the necessary paperwork to prove my intentions, of course. I knew that the military's Air Force range was nearby when I agreed to take on this particular study. My documentation seemed to satisfy them. They wearily agreed that I could stay. The nervous glances they exchanged told me that something was amiss. I was more worried about my insects at the time, so I chose not to press them for information. They left and warned me not to document anything occurring beyond the perimeter of my camp. I agreed to those terms. I had enough moths within the immediate area to gather the information I needed. The second night, I saw what they wanted to keep secret. A loud electronic pulse resonated through the area. It shook my equipment and scared away the moths I was watching. At that point, I had no choice but to surrender to my curiosity. I looked to the west and saw that another truck, this one much larger, had parked in the groove between two hills. A long bed was attached to the back of the vehicle. Upon that platform was something that looked like a satellite dish. A red bulb was blinking in its center, and after every few beats, another wave of sound radiated from that direction. It was loud but low, like an alarm that was only meant to be felt by my bones. This went on for 2 hours. My research for the night was crippled. Then the light blinked off, and in the darkness, I lost sight of the vehicle and the satellite. I'm still not sure what that equipment was. I do know, however, that something responded. The next night, the sound came again. This time, when I looked, there was no vehicle hiding between the hills of the desert. There was no light on the ground either. This time, the lights were in the sky. In the distance, a large triangular mass was hovering in the air. It must have been 500 feet above the previous location of the truck and the satellite. Lights were flashing from the corners of the triangle. I thought at first that I was hallucinating. I thought that the darkness was concealing the true nature of the structure in the distance. It couldn't be floating, I said, certainly not without the growl of a motor or the whirring of a blade. But there it was. With each strobe of the red lights, I saw edges of the craft become more defined. It was larger than any vehicle I'd ever seen. A dozen of the military's huge trucks could have parked on the back of the mysterious craft. Like before, after a sequence of lights had concluded, an electronic pulse rippled across the desert. This one was stronger. I heard the sound, and a few moments later, I felt the wind push against my hair. I watched the shape for an hour. Then it turned, pointed one of its corners toward the sky, and vanished. It blinked out of existence as quickly as the satellite's red light had been turned off the night before. My study, I decided, was over. I left immediately. Instead of finding the open road, I found the military waiting for me. Different personnel this time. More of them, too. They were carrying rifles, and not one of them looked glad to see me. They didn't ask where I was headed. They didn't ask what I had seen. Instead, they told me I should leave. They told me the desert air was a little too harsh on my lungs, and that probably the nights were a little too cold to be out there. I told them that was fine, that I was headed home. I hadn't seen a thing. I didn't have a story to tell, except for the one about the moths. I would have agreed to anything to get out of that situation. My reputation was damaged after I failed to complete my research. My study wasn't published. Grants have been much harder to come by, almost impossible. As I sit here now and watch my career decline, regardless of my undying passion for the work, I find myself asking, why not? Why not tell the story? It isn't anything new. We all know they exist. I guess maybe the shock of it all exists in the rest of that truth, the part they don't want me to tell. Not only do they exist, but they're communicating with us. And shockingly, we are communicating back to them. I haven't always made the best decisions. That has been especially true during the most transitional stages of my life. Changing jobs, moving houses, ending relationships. Last year, I was going through a pretty nasty breakup. The kind where you stop thinking logically, you know? I thought it was the enlightening catalyst I'd always needed. I thought I'd go off the grid, buy some property in a remote area, build one of those made-to-order homes, and disappear from society for a while. I thought it would open my mind, or at least give me a few years to focus on myself. I should still do that sometime. In this instance, however, that didn't work out. The timing wasn't right, I guess. I bought some old ranch land in the Pacific Northwest. It was beautiful, although abandoned. The trees were trying to swallow the flattened plains right back up. Another generation of isolation, and the land I bought probably would have been indistinguishable from the mountain that flanked the property. Now that I'm writing it all down, maybe that's what happened. Maybe I got in the way of Mother Nature reclaiming her land. The first step was one I clumsily took on my own. I thought I'd handle it all alone at the time. Like I said, I made bad decisions. I needed to cut down the grass and the reeds and the brush. Everything that had overgrown in the years that the land went untended. Clear space for the house, right? That's what I did. Unfortunately, that meant my first week on the property was spent sleeping in my truck, riding a lawnmower, and hacking down bushes with a hatchet I had no business trying to use. I made it 3 nights, and then I saw them. Men that seemed to be 1 story tall were wandering in from the woods. They stalked the perimeter of my property. I don't know what shook me awake that night. I only remember lifting off of the chair and squinting through the windshield. I was tired and blinking out the exhaustion from my eyes, so I could barely process the shapes in the distance or their staggering height. But don't worry, because they gave me a second chance. I spent the entire 4th day convincing myself that I'd dreamed the vision of giants. Then came the 4th night. I should have been expecting them. I wish I could say that I was bright and alert when those early morning hours crept in. I wasn't. But this time there was no doubting what pulled me from my slumber. The truck was shaking. I didn't have to look for an explanation either. My eyes knew where to fall the moment they opened. One of the men was outside. I could only see the bottom of his chest from the top of the passenger side window. What I mistook for clothes quickly became fur. He was covered in it, head to toe, matted and unkempt like a stray dog. The fingers that pushed against the frame of the vehicle were thick and unwieldy. Each one ended in a claw that looked as though it had been sharpened with a stone. It was too easy to imagine those claws ripping into my flesh. I did the bravest thing I could think of. I honked the horn. That was enough to startle the creature. I watched it turn and then run. Only as it pivoted did I get to see its face. It was far from the human expression I was expecting. Its nose was flat and its lips were thin. Tusks sprouted from its mouth like a boar's. The eyes, still watching me as it began to run, were dark and narrow. It was neither the face of a human being nor the face I would have expected to be worn by a monster. It was not snarling or screaming. Those tusks, despite their unnatural positioning, didn't appear to be used for any kind of gore. But I think that made it worse. Not knowing what I was seeing, being unable to attach it to anything I'd heard described. It left me more in the dark than ever. All I know for sure in that moment was that I hadn't dreamt the creatures. I watched them stomp back into the trees, escaping the rays of the moonlight. I also knew that I couldn't stick around. Maybe it was only curious about the car. No one had lived here in so long I could understand that. But that curiosity was powerful. It could have thrown my truck onto its side if it really wanted to. It could have smashed the glass or ripped the door from its hinges. What would I have done then? What would I do if it did get its hands on me? Those powerful fingers would hardly strain, plucking my limbs from my body. I'd wilt like a flower in its hands. Since I hadn't exactly planned on being buried out there on that land, I gave it up. I got out of there the very next morning. I made the phone calls that I could and tried to report my encounter to any authorities that would listen. Not many did. Most hung up on me, or laughed, or yelled at me for wasting their time. Eventually, I felt it was a waste of time, too. What else was I supposed to think? Seeing something that no one else believed in. Even I had spent some time believing that the giant creatures were a figment of my imagination. And I couldn't really bring anyone out to that land, could I? No, but I could sell it. I don't make good decisions, especially during a transition, so I listed the property and I didn't even bother to warn the couple who took it off my hands. I should have. I know that now. I'm dealing with that guilt every day. I guess that's why I'm telling the story again, huh? Sounds pretty selfish when I put it like that. Maybe that's why I was going through that heartbreak to begin with. Who knows? But the truth is that this really happened to me and I wanted to share it with people who will understand. There is way more to life than the eye can see. More than science can theorize or religion can explain. We often use these things to validate our experience, thus avoiding the reality that we will never have all the answers. I think that the dead live amongst us. Your naked eye not being able to see them does not mean they do not exist. I know I'm getting straight to the point, but if you've seen what I have, you would agree 100%. Now, I have always been skeptical of mediums and psychics who claim to have the ability to speak with and see the dead. I believe there are people with such gifts, but that they are far from a TV personality or a fortune teller. They can be ordinary people who come into contact with ghosts or spirits of those who have passed on. I live in Miami, Florida, where the sun always shines. Growing up with my grandmother in her little house near the beach was the highlight of my adolescence. We would collect shells on our morning walks to take back and clean before putting them in our shell jar. I still, to this day, have the jar on my fireplace mantle as a decoration and keepsake. We would sit on her screened-in porch, listening to the waves crashing while playing Scrabble. It was always so peaceful there, a feeling I wish I could have bottled up for later in life. When she passed, my world was shattered. At 17 years old, I understood what death meant, but it didn't make it any easier. I was broken for years, unable to piece my life back together. It wasn't until 6 years later that I gathered the strength to go back to her house. Nothing was more unsettling than being there knowing she would never come back. I went through her belongings, eyes full of tears, smiling at times from the good memories. I gathered some of her jewelry, the shell jar, a few paintings, old photographs, and the Scrabble game we used to play. I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders as I had avoided grappling with the loss up until that moment. Still, I struggled with letting go. I could not grasp never seeing or speaking to her again. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. Why does everyone have to die? So, like the nerd I am, I began to research. How to speak to the dead, how to see loved ones who have passed, how to summon spirits. My search history was full of questions. The more I read, the more my curiosity was sparked. Previously terrified by all things horror-related, I was suddenly interested in the spiritual realm. I watched 1,000,001 horror movies related to ghosts. I became hyper-focused on figuring out how to communicate with my grandmother. But while hyper-focused, I never lost my sanity by wanting to try a Ouija board. If my horror movie binge-watching taught me nothing else, it taught me not to mess with a Ouija board. Plus, my research told me all I would really need is my mind, and maybe her personal belongings, or to be at her house. I tried to implement what I had learned by thinking about her and talking out loud as if she was already there. At times I thought that it worked, but it really was a placebo effect. I believe my efforts were too forceful when they should have come more naturally. Frustrated, I stopped trying. Instead, I focused on my own mental health and let her spirit rest. My mind was so wrapped up in chasing her spirit that I neglected to connect with my own self. Through meditation and breathing practices, I reached a place of deep consciousness and awareness. I decided to take off work and dedicated a whole day to trying to speak to her. I packed and took the shell jar, our Scrabble game, and a few pictures before heading to her beach house. After arriving, I was once again met with nostalgia and the feelings of sorrow. This time they didn't last long because I knew for a fact that she was there. I was overcome with such emotion that I immediately had to sit and just cry it out. Crying in that moment was necessary because I had not done so in months. I wiped my tears and took the shell jar and pictures with me to the beach out front, stopping to put the Scrabble game on the porch. It was fairly sunny and the radiating heat calmed my nerves slightly. I sat in the sand almost in the exact spot we used to gather shells and closed my eyes. I didn't think about it much. I just visualized her standing in front of me. With both hands on the shell jar and the photographs in my lap, I sat in complete silence for at least 5 minutes. Then a breeze came by, bringing with it the faint smell of white diamond perfume, a distinct scent that many children and grandchildren will always remember. My heart fluttered because at that moment I knew it was her. I opened my eyes, seeing nothing at first. Then my eyes were drawn directly to an area to the right about 20 feet away in the shallow water. There she was in her favorite white dress looking right at me. Though always beautiful, she was more youthful and refreshed than I had ever seen. Her dress rippled in the wind, and as the wind sped up, she was swept away. The emotion I felt in that very moment was indescribable. I can't tell you whether it was happiness, sadness, fear, or shock. Probably all of them. The moment I wanted so bad for years finally happened, and I didn't know how to react. Now 3 years later, I can confidently say that I always know where exactly to find her, walking on the beach or in the water. So anyway, I just wanted to share this with you because I thought it might be something your listeners would connect to. Basically, it really is true that things exist beyond the world that we think we know. I had nothing against squirrels until they started coming into my house. They've always been annoying, but we pretty much let each other be. I live a bit south of Trenton, New Jersey, near Mount Holly. I assume squirrels are a problem everywhere. I didn't know though because I've always lived in this area, and I haven't done much traveling outside of New Jersey. I started noticing an extra number of squirrel in my backyard last Halloween. I'd gotten some pumpkins that were going to be made into jack-o'-lanterns, and I had put them outside until I was ready to carve them. Right away they started getting chewed up and were ruined. Before long, the squirrels had whittled them down to nothing. I was outside looking around and saw that the big tree from the neighbor's house had grown pretty close to my roof. That made it really easy for squirrels to scamper around on top of my house. I didn't think much of it though, and just figured it was a lesson learned to not leave your pumpkins outside. Anyway, about a week after Halloween, I was in my house one night and heard this horrible screeching sound outside. I looked out my back window, but I couldn't see anything. My back porch light is broken. It's not just the light bulb, it's something electrical, so I didn't know how to fix it. The noise was loud, and to be honest, it was also creepy. I was really starting to wonder why I was attracting all this wildlife. I couldn't imagine what could make that screeching sound. I put it out of my mind and went to bed. But the next morning when I woke up, I was hearing some really odd thumping noises. I thought it was my neighbor working outside, but then I heard a crash outside my bedroom door. I rushed out and saw one of my wooden carvings laying on the floor. I heard a bunch of shuffling in the bathroom and headed back there. To my surprise, a squirrel was staring back at me. I couldn't figure out what had happened. The only thing I could assume was that it had gotten down the chimney somehow. I screamed and it ran away from me and crawled into my under-sink bathroom cabinet. I was really freaked out and didn't know what to do. It wouldn't come out for anything. I left the back door open, which was really close to the bathroom. I assumed it would just automatically sense the fresh air and run out. But no dice. I played squirrel sounds for it on my phone thinking that would entice it to come out. But nothing worked. Then I ordered a squirrel trap on Amazon and had it overnighted to me. I read that squirrels love apples and peanut butter. I crammed the squirrel trap into my tiny bathroom and set it with the food inside. But the bastard managed to get the apple out without springing the trap. Then it went back into the cabinet and just hung out there. It lived in that cabinet for 72 hours before I was finally able to trap it and relocate it. It was traumatizing, but I was glad it was over. Until 3 days later when it happened again. I woke up to another one of those jerks in my house. This time I had secured the door of the bathroom, so if it happened again, a squirrel couldn't hide out in there. I managed to get it out the back door, but it was really unprecedented to have such an unlikely thing happen again. I should mention that I'd still been hearing that screeching sound several days in a row. I started wondering if there were a connection. That night, I was sitting on my couch minding my own business. I'd been hearing this screeching intermittently. Then I heard this little scurrying sound, and I looked toward my kitchen and saw this mouse just running along the baseboards. I've lived in this house for over 10 years without so much as an ant coming in. I felt surrounded and really creeped out. I got back on Amazon and ordered mouse traps. I got my flashlight and opened the back door to see if I could tell where that sound was coming from. Even before I turned on the flashlight, I saw something big crouched on the top of my back fence. The worst part was, it was looking at me. Its eyes were yellow and glowing. We had just come off of Halloween, so the impression I got was something like a goblin. I didn't even want to, but I turned on my flashlight. It was even worse than I expected. It had this elongated skeletal face, like a horse or a dragon. It had scaly skin. As soon as I had turned on the flashlight, it had risen up from its crouched position and I could see that it had wings. It was terrifying to think that it might fly at me. I slammed the door closed and that screeching started up again. I turned off all the lights in the house so it wouldn't be able to see me in there. I've never been so petrified before in my life. I kept trying to watch out my window to see what it would do. The neighbors behind my alley had their lights on, so I could kind of make it out. After about an hour, it turned its back to my house and half jumped and half flew off my fence. I couldn't tell which direction it went. There was certainly nothing I could order on Amazon for that freaking thing. I'm still really scared, and I don't even know what I would say if I tried to report it. I'm starting to think these animals were coming in my house because they were scared of it too. I'm hoping maybe one of your listeners might have had a similar thing happen to them, and maybe some advice. I've tried for a long time to forget this freaky experience I had a few years ago. Even when I close my eyes to sleep, I can't get it out of my head. It's not easy to talk about this. I'd bottled it up for too long. My mom, sister, and I were on a trip to the coast. We didn't go on a lot of trips. Not since my dad left. Having a single mom doesn't make for the easiest life. But she tried. She definitely seemed super excited but didn't tell us where we were going. It's a surprise, she said. We stopped a couple times for snacks and bathroom breaks on the way. It was a really bright day and hot. I remember sweating. We drove along the coast. My sister and I stuck our heads out the window. It was the first time I'd seen the ocean. And to date, that weekend was the last. We pulled up in front of a really tall house. There must have been 20 steep stairs leading to the door. At first, I thought it was a joke. The place looked 100 years old. I thought there was no way anyone lived there. But my mom assured us it was a friend of a friend's house, and we could stay the weekend. She held up the key and showed it to us to prove her point. We all headed up the steps, unlocked the door, and plopped our bags inside. The inside of the house was no better. It felt like a house out of a horror movie to me. But what choice did I have being a young teen? I had to trust my mom, right? Anyway, the first thing we did was head outside to check out the area a bit, see what all was around. When we got back, we walked in the house only to hear something strange. It sounded like a weird clicking inside the walls. I asked my mom and sister if they heard it. My sister ignored me and my mom said it was just my imagination and that I should unpack my bag. I listened and didn't hear it again. My mom and sister went into the kitchen to make dinner. I walked around the house, turning on the lights as I went. I heard it again. Clicking sounds. This time, it sounded like it was coming from upstairs. I wasn't sure if I was ready to scope it out alone. I'm not exactly the bravest person in the world. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched the landing up above. While I stood there looking, I swear I saw something pass across from one side to the other, and I heard the clicking again. I didn't scream or anything, but believe me, I wanted to. When I turned around, my mom was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She asked me if I was okay and said she had heard me make a gasping noise. I looked upstairs again and saw nothing, just shadows and dust. So I told her all was good. We ate dinner in the dingy dining room. I still couldn't believe we were staying in this house. To me, it was old and dirty and gross. But my sister said nothing about it, and obviously my mom was trying not to bring attention to it so that the trip would be positive for all of us. It started to get dark after we cleaned up the kitchen and washed the dishes. The house got colder as it got darker, and in the dark silence, I could hear every creak of the floorboards as I walked around. I went into the bathroom and heard the noise again. Clicking sounds now somewhere above me. Whatever was in here, it was upstairs. I was convinced of that, and it seemed to be everywhere I was, which was becoming very concerning. Me and my mom and my sister played a board game in the living room. I couldn't concentrate on it though. I was too busy listening to the house. Finally, my sister started yawning and my mom said it was probably time for bed. I headed to my room and locked the door behind me. It felt silly, but also seemed like the right thing to do. I sat on the bed and literally just stared at the door handle, waiting for it to turn. I was convinced it would happen. Instead of seeing anything, I eventually rolled over and dozed off. I woke up suddenly and realized that it was the sound of that clicking again. It was louder now, right outside the door. I was now sitting up in the bed not knowing what to do. I thought about yelling for my mom, but that seemed too chicken even for me. Should I go over and check out? But I couldn't do it. Not only was my mind not into it, but my legs also wouldn't budge. The noise stopped again. And now I really couldn't sleep. There was no way. I knew that much. And then the worst thing in my life happened. I had to pee, and the bathroom was out the door and down the hall. I tried to hold it and then ignore it, but when you have to go, you have to go. I'm sure my anxiety levels had a lot to do with that. I crept out of the room and walked quietly down the hall to the bathroom. I listened carefully for the clicking sound. Thank goodness, it was silent except the sounds of my feet creaking on the floorboards. I opened the bathroom door and flipped on the light. Right behind me now was the clicking sounds. This time, I couldn't contain the scream. I tried and it came out as a yelp, and even though I was scared out of my mind, I still felt embarrassed. I spun around and saw something that I'll never forget. It made me regret turning on the bathroom light. Following me was a grotesque childlike thing crawling back and forth. It was staring at me from its deep black eyes. The face had no features except those eyes and a wide, empty mouth, which was just a hole in the bottom of its face. I moved to my right, and it skittered to its left to stay in front of me. It was fast and crawling on all fours, sort of like a huge insect, and I could now see that the clicking sound was its hands and feet on the wooden floor. The nails were long and yellow. It was filthy and as pale as paper. I couldn't contain the scream this time. It came out of my mouth full on as I watched the thing scurry away on all fours. The clicking was as loud as ever. My mom burst out of her room and looked at me. Her eyes were huge and frightened from having heard me scream. She took one look at my face and ran over. She asked if I was okay, but I couldn't say anything. I couldn't get out the words. She didn't turn and look at the stairs or anything. She was totally focused on me, and to this day I still don't know if she heard what I heard, but I know that she did not see what I saw. I slept in her room that night and the rest of the weekend. Well, I didn't sleep at all, but I was in there,